Hello and welcome to the vlog. Today with me is Jared Wilson, host of the Martial Thoughts podcast. Hello, Jared.
Hey, Papa, how you doing?
Good, good. How are you?
For almost the end of COVID, I'm not doing too bad.
Mm-hmm.
I
That's
got my
excellent.
I got my second vaccine, so I'm in a week and a half. I'll be immune for
Oh,
everything.
that's wonderful. I
Yeah,
am scheduled for my vaccine first dose this week, coming in, actually
awesome.
tomorrow. So very
I
eager for that.
It'll make your shoulder hurt, but apart from that,
Yeah,
for me it was fine.
that's wonderful. So I am delighted to have you here in our vlog today. Just for the listeners, we have spoken before, and I've been
Mhm.
following you for a long time, actually, and your Martial Thoughts podcast. But
Make
then,
me sound old.
yeah, I am old. I am old. Um, but actually, have had the honor of speaking with you before for an interview we did for your podcast and also A Thousand Exits, which is the podcast that I have with Dan Monkas. And from here, we say hello, Dan. He's celebrating his wife's birthday today, and so
Happy
um,
birthday.
yeah, exactly. And so that was a delightful conversation, but I never actually had you in my YouTube channel. So it is beyond amazing to have you here, and I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Oh, it should be fun.
So Jared, tell us a little bit about yourself, and uh, clearly everyone wants to know about the martial arts journey. But if you take a step back from there, just what is it? Where do you live? What do you do? And then why is it that you find the martial arts fascinating? And what do you do in martial arts?
Okay. Well, I'm currently living in Nashville, Tennessee. I'm currently studying a system called Namiru Aikiheiho. Is It's a traditional Japanese system that is allowed to change, as opposed to some of the what are called koru, which are the old systems, which are allowed to be flexible, but the teachings have to kind of be the same. We're allowed to change the way we do things. It is traditionally based. It does have all the same parts that a koru has. In fact, sometimes I've heard that a new term I've come across is called a neo-koru, because a koru has to be developed by a specific date, by 1868, before the Meiji Restoration occurred. Ours was developed after that, but we have all the trappings of the koru, so I've heard that as a term for it. Um, that's where I am right now, what I'm doing right now. Professionally, I'm a high school teacher, so I've one of the things I've been interested in is how do we teach martial arts? What is the skill acquisition uh, like in martial arts? So I kind of have a leg up on that. Uh, like I said, I run Martial Thoughts podcast. I've been doing it since 2013, December of 2013. So yes, it has been a while. um,
And it's clearly one of the best established martial arts podcasts out there. I mean,
I think oldest is at least oldest continuous. Maybe I think I beat Jeremy by like that much.
really, that's good. Hey, Jeremy Lesniak, from here, we say hello to you and thank you.
Yeah, he and I are good friends. We communicate pretty regularly. So, yeah. Hey, Jeremy, if you're listening or watching. Yeah, my goal with that it has changed over time. Initially, it was me and my friends just kind of sitting around after the dojo and just saying, kind of same thing everybody says. These are really good conversations. We should be recording these.
Mhm.
Finally, I said, okay, well then let's do it. Let's record them. And one of the members of our dojo had like really nice recording equipment that was portable, and we just started recording kind of our conversations. I started coming up with kind of a I don't know a outline for the show, and it kind of then I about a year after that I moved to Nashville and kind of had to leave all that behind, so I had to completely change the format of it, and it became mostly an interview show where I find authors or somebody who I think has an interesting something to say about martial arts, and I interview them on some specific topic that they want to talk about, or wrote in their book or whatever it happens to be. So that's where the podcast kind of is. I've been doing that for a while now. Um, let's see. Originally, my martial art was study was Aikido, and I studied that for roughly 15 years, something like that, and before I moved up here. Um, What was the last part of the question? What do I think is interesting about martial arts? Was that the last part of the question?
Yeah, and that one we're going to delve into. So you can answer now a little if you wish, or we can leave that for later. We're going to definitely delve into that a little bit later.
Okay. And I've said this on my podcast. For me, you know, if you remember back in the DARE program, if you're, you know, old like I am,
Yeah.
talk about, you know, a gateway drug, you know, it's like, well, this will lead you to this, will lead you to this. For me, that's what martial arts is, you know, because I'm studying, I use myself as an example, a Japanese martial art, a traditional Japanese martial art. Well, that means I'm gonna, in order to really, really understand it, the reasoning behind the way that they do things, I have to understand more about Japanese history and some of the Japanese philosophies that go into this, and some of the Japanese religion, and some of the Japanese language. I said, well, okay, well then, you know, how does that compare to the Chinese that it came from? Okay, well, that's kind of interesting too. It's like, well, you know, does any of that really help me punch and kick better? No, but it helps me become a better martial artist overall. It kind of puts the art part in the martial part, if you want to think of it like that. And then from there, it kind of just branches out, you know, all over the place. My area of, I don't know if you want to call it study, but amateur study, my amateur historian hour, is in Japanese martial arts and how that kind of interties with everything. But yeah, I mean, it leads you all over the place into all sorts of things. You know, I'm doing without promising anything, I'm researching a book on American martial arts. So I've had to research bayonet techniques and, you know, the American Revolution. And, you know, it's like, there's always one more rabbit hole to fall down in. And I guess that's what I kind of like about the martial arts is, for me, it's as much an intellectual pursuit as it is a physical one.
Yeah. Yeah, just some of the things you mentioned, I've been taking notes because I want to develop them. So clearly, you know a lot about the history of the martial arts, and full disclaimer here, I am fascinated with the history of the arts. And you said, well, it doesn't necessarily make me, you know, kick and punch better, but to me, even though the training is a fundamental part of my martial art, and I train very consistently, it's almost like the layer of richness it gives me to look into the history, as you said, takes it to a level of fascination that is incredible. Even just from the standpoint of things clicking, like realizing history explains a lot of what we do and why it became that. And it's not about judging that history, it's about like, it really is an incredible thing. You know, the way I started rationalizing this was someone said, well, why study history? So, look, I love the martial art and my system has given me so much. And out of that, not being naturally someone who loved history, and when I was a kid in school, I didn't particularly like history. When you love something so much, you want to know more about it. It's like this passion led me to, where did this come from? And it's just, there's so much there. You mentioned Koryu, which is something that I've never explained to my listeners. So we'll get into that in a minute. You also mentioned learning, which is another one of the topics that I'm interested in. And that also has to do with your background. Full disclaimer, I took a class from you on the history of the samurai.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And multi-part class that was really incredible. And, you know, I think it's one of those examples in which generally very little is known. There's a lot that people know from the, you know, surface.
Yeah, the pop culture stuff.
Exactly, which is good. But then if you get into it, there's so many facts and twists to and that alone was a very, very interesting, thought-provoking one. So we have a lot of threads to pull here. Why don't we continue on the Koryu stuff that you said? Because even though I'm not sure I mentioned this, but my original first art was Japanese, actually Kempo. But Mitose, from the Mitose family, who was Japanese but from Hawaii, right? From Hawaii. And I there was a time in which the history of the Japanese arts was one of the ones that I really took the most. But I haven't really spoken too much in my channel about that. So when you say it's a Koryu art, let's take a step back and explain to our listeners, what does that mean?
Okay. Well, you know, let's look at the word as itself, you know, the etymology of the word. You can break it up into the two kanji, the two characters. Ryu, we generally translate in English as school, Shorin Ryu Karate, something like that, the Shorin school of karate. But there's a connotation to it that we don't quite get in English. And there's a connotation of a stream or a flow, saying that it's knowledge being passed down through the ages. So there's a connotation there that we don't quite get from school, unless you're talking about more like school of thought. That might be a better analogy to it. And then ko just means, in this case, is old. So it's old school, literally. Not the new hip way of meaning old school, but actual old school. These were martial. When something is designated a koru, it's a system of combat from Japan that was developed before Japan modernized, before 1868. That's officially the cutoff. There's a couple that give a little bit of wiggle room. They developed just after it, but it's really just this guy's nephew who went and started his own school type of thing. So they're allowed to do that, but essentially 1868 is the cutoff. It's theoretically kind of the old school stuff that the samurai actually used type of thing, except for most of them were, with one, maybe two exceptions, were all developed after 1600, which is kind of the age of peace for Japan, when they kind of became a military aristocracy, which, I mean, we could go into the politics of that, what was good and bad about that, but they had an age of peace. So even though we think of these, samurai arts, it's like, well, they are, but they were developed for a time when there weren't battlefield uses for them. So most of, I shouldn't say most, that's a generalization. A lot of the schools are involved for dueling aspects, one-on-one, go meet me at the big pine by the temple type of thing. Anyone and if you don't show up, I'm calling you a coward and putting on a placard in front of town type of thing. It's a very Old West in that way. That's why a lot of the samurai movies got turned into Old West movies, and they worked out really well, because there's a lot of similarities in the kind of themes in those. And that's kind of what a koru is. And originally, and again, depends on how far back you want to go, there weren't specializations of well, for example, koru generally are more weapon arts. There's a lot more weapon arts than unarmed part of it, because one, it's supposed to be for samurai who are soldiers, not fighting in the streets unarmed, right? I mean, if you're down to trying to punch some guy on a battlefield, you're in a really bad shape. That means your bow broke, your sword broke, your spear broke, your minions behind you are all gone. You're pretty screwed at that point. Same way today, if you're if you're on the battlefields of Afghanistan trying to punch people, that's not a good place to be. So it was very little empty hand. The empty hand that was there was more for about, crap, my weapon got knocked out of my hand. How do I stop him from killing me with his weapon type of thing? And that's where most of the techniques kind of originated. And then they found that basically the same movements that you do with a sword in your hand, you can do when someone else has a sword coming at you, you can do when neither of you has a sword. The same basic applications, the same basic principles work. And that's one of the things about koru is it's very principle based. In my system, I kind of joke around with the people. I said, look, we only do like 5 things, but we do it like in 100 different ways. There's only 5 things we really do, because all the movements end up being the same 5 movements over and over again if you break it down into the pieces of it. So, and that's the way, if you were teaching a battlefield art, that's what you would have to teach. You would have to teach them, do these 5 things, but do them really well. Learning 1,000 techniques and 18 stances, and it's like, okay, well, if he lowers his sword down 3 inches, you've got to raise yours up 3 inches. No, it's got to be much more immediate than that. It's got to be, I know 5 things. When they come at me, I'm going to do one of these 5 things. So there's that aspect to it. And that's kind of what, I'm kind of meandering through the whole stream of the koru there, but that's kind of what koru is it's more, immediately decisive ideas of battlefield martial arts, even though it evolved into be more dueling. And maybe and in some of the old texts, I think Hagakure is where it comes from. They call them flowery techniques. Is one of the ways they describe the newer stuff, from the 1700s.
Have you studied some Japanese language?
I speak Dojo Japanglish.
Good.
So, I took 2 classes of it in college, so I know enough to know the structure, and through reading I can recognize occasional characters, but I would nowhere say that I've studied it.
Yeah.
That's one of my bucket list goals, is to actually learn and be able to read Japanese and be able to. There's a lot of Japanese martial arts books from the old school stuff that isn't translated into English that I would love to access.
Yeah. So, all right, Jared. So let's peel this back. I'm fascinated, and with the little knowledge I have of the history of Japanese systems, I'm going to use what you said to just keep peeling back. I may make mistakes, and if someone, how YouTube audiences can be very critical. So, what you said is not historical. So we're just going to, we're trying our best, and obviously there's a lot of knowledge here that we can make the most of. Like, for me to have you as a guest is great. So some of my assumptions may be challenged here. When I look at Japanese systems, the way you describe Koryu, if I look at old Japanese before the influence, not only before what happened in society in Japan when it started modernizing, which I know less about, but a lot of people see systems like karate as purely Japanese, but to me, it's a modern thing that happened with the influence of the Okinawans and the Chinese. So if we separate that, if we imagine that branch of that triangle go before all of that, the Japanese art is what you're describing. In other words, Koryu would describe the martial arts of Japan, right? Which in this case, I feel is safe to assume they had a military origin. And I say this because you're talking about the battlefield, right? And that's very interesting to me, because even though there is a big community of martial arts people, researchers, or people who like to talk about them, who say all martial arts are military, I don't believe so. I think there is clearly martial arts that come from the military, and many arts that, just using common sense, not even what they tell you about them, you can see they're not. It's just very obvious. So your description of, when we look at old school jujitsu and you don't see obvious punches, your description of the battlefield conditions kind of make that very obvious, right? But that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot of things that are explained in the system by virtue of being the reality of the battlefield with armor and weapons, for example.
Yeah, punch a guy with a helmet and see what happens.
Yes, exactly, right? Now, I find that so fascinating, because I think what happened in China, China is too big and too many systems, too much complexity, but the systems that I have been more attracted to, I do not believe they come from the military. And these people had to basically defend themselves without police or law enforcement.
I'm going to interrupt here for 1 second, because there's actually, if you know what HEMA is, historical European martial arts, where they're using old treaties and actually trying to reintroduce European fighting systems, and they've done an amazing job. There's a gentleman in China who's trying to do that with the military arts in China, going back to the old military treaties and trying to reinstitute, the spear work, I think is the one that I'm thinking of, which are completely different than, like you said, they're not the civilian arts, right?
Exactly.
If you're doing something that's called self-defense, it is not military.
Right.
I mean, it can't be.
Exactly.
The goal of a military. Military is not about the individual defending themselves.
Yeah. And that also is a lesson in common sense for modern, when someone in modern society is looking to do a martial art, and you hear these commercials connect those two as if it was the same thing. Like, you're going to learn real self-defense because it comes from a former SWAT or Navy SEAL. And I'm like, always, always use common sense, because a lot of the things that, unfortunately, in the martial arts, there's a lot of madness, right? We just happen to love it and be crazy about it, but there's so much madness. And to me, that's a clear one. China obviously had thousands of years of military history, and the bow and arrow and the spear would be probably the oldest martial arts you have. But the arts that we talk about today, especially the what we call the Southern Chinese boxing arts, I do not believe at all. I mean, these are completely different lines of history, right?
Right, and they're not mutually exclusive. It's not saying that you can't use one for the other.
No.
But it's to use the toolbox example, I can turn a screwdriver around and bang in a nail with it, and it works, but that's not the best way to do it.
Right, exactly. So very good. So back to Koryu and the Japanese systems. Japan is going through these multiple periods. There's a lot of warfare, and they have their military art, right?
Well, I'm going to interrupt right there again, because don't think of Japan as being unified in any way, shape, or form.
Right.
Each little region would have its own specific clan, would have its own martial art. And these were state level secrets, right? I mean, these were, they didn't even have dojos at this point. This was literally, it's more like master apprentice type things. It's this guy's really good at fighting. He survived the last 3 battles we had. Go find out what he did. I'm paraphrasing I'm sure there was much more formality to it. But that was more like it. There wasn't any kind of licensing for teaching. There wasn't even the Menkyo that we think about. And this is all pre-1600. These guys keep surviving the battles, find out what they do that's good.
Exactly. Which begs the question, at what point in history someone sat down to make a system out of that, write it down? I mean, that could have happened hundreds of years or even more. By the point these systems had. Another thing is, if someone has a talent and has survived many battles, all of a sudden they're like, hey, help us, man.
Yeah.
And they're like, okay, I'll do what I can. But by necessity of what's happening historically in that moment, what happens in the next generation is already very different, because for all we know, this guy doesn't even know how to teach that, which is what's so fascinating, right? That's why, if you follow me, it's always martial arts as a training program that somehow has managed to survive and create skill. I think that's the genius of the arts, whether military or not. How come in an environment that would have been so easy to just say, look, I don't know how to pass this on to anyone. How come we've created a system that can create skill, even though it's not like the most common thing, but it still happens generations later. I'm amazed at that phenomenon.
Yeah, that is one of the reasons we have styles or systems. You can see my Bruce Lee picture in the back. I can see your Bruce Lee picture in the back. I love Bruce's idea that, systems are stagnation and that they, we should get rid of them all type of thing. It's like, no. That's looking at all the bad parts and only looking at that part. Look at the part where it is taking a specific aspect of combat, of some sort of combat, self-defense, battlefield, whatever definition you want to use for it, it's looking at one particular piece. And then, like you said, it's creating a systemic way to get better at that one thing. That is the purpose of a system. Now, some systems might take too big of a pie and they make you kind of good at a bunch of things, but not excellent at any one thing. Some of them say, nope, we're only going to focus on Japanese swordsmanship, and that's what we're going to be really good at. That type of thing. But that's the purpose of a system, is making sure that this is a learnable, programmable aspect of combat that you can get better at.
Yeah, and as we said earlier, not all systems are military, but in the case of the Koryu, which it was basically like what we just said would have had to happen, because this need to enable a group of people quickly who didn't know how to do this to go to the battlefield, it would just be being a natural thing that they had to do, to not say the next day all of them got eliminated in the battlefield and there it was, that martial art died. So it's so much at the root of what it would even mean to survive. And I'm just talking about that example. There's an equivalent way to say that in the civilian arts, but just to stick to the Koryu, that's why the system makes a lot of sense. And it's hard to produce that skill. It's hard. I mean, there's a difference between seeing some greatness and seeing, if you give a guy a couple years and dedication, can you produce that skill in someone else? That's incredible.
Again, when we look at samurai before the 1600s, there was a lot more social variability on who samurai were. So you had the people that were the professional warrior caste, right? This is kind of the way I think of them, is like, if you think of, as a kind of an equivalent time frame, like the Revolutionary War, right? George Washington and his generals were, some of them were professional soldiers. They were professional officers who knew the art of combat. But then their job was to take these people who were just kind of farmers the previous day and turn them into soldiers. Even the samurai of the pre 1600s, there were levels. There was the professional, this is all I do is work on combat. Then there was some other layer that was below that were they were samurai farmers. They were farmers part of the year, but then they also were expected to have their own armor and weapons and join in the battle when it needed to be. And then there's below that, which are, ashigaru, which are basically spearmen. Those are kind of the guys, the Civil War guys with the bayonets that are coming at you, that kind of equivalent level of, but you had to turn all of those guys into warriors, into soldiers.
Yeah.
One of the things I think people miss on a lot of Koru is the mental aspect that they train you on. You have to be able to, when someone is swinging a sword at your head, do exactly what it is you need to do to win, whatever that one particular technique they're teaching you with. There's a lot of mental aspect that's taught in the Koru that is hidden in their kata. The kata are, and we'll talk about this too at some point, I'm sure, but the kata are done specifically. You have to do kata. I don't care if it's solo kata, whatever it is. You have to do all of your training with at least one or two safety mechanisms built into the kata. And as long as you know what those are, is it that you're moving slow? Is it that you're not hitting the target on purpose? You're aiming over here when their head is here. There are safety mechanisms built in. But as long as you know that that's what you're doing and the other person knows what you're doing, it's still a viable training method. So that when you take those safety measures out and on the next kata, you use a different safety method. This one I'm aiming wrong, but this one I'm aiming the right, but I'm going slower. So between all the different kata, all the different drills, you kind of have removed all the safety measures overall. So that's kind of the way a lot of Koru train these things.
So you use the word kata, and I don't know that it means the same thing that we may assume. So in the context you're describing, what is kata?
It's form, right? I mean, that's what the word means. If you're thinking of like the karate kata, where it's the guy doing moves in a certain pattern on the ground, that's one way you can use it, and it essentially means the same thing. In Koru, which again I'm using swords because that's generally one of the weapons that most Japanese Koru have, it's usually a two-man kata. I'll put it this way: our system has two-man kata. There's an attack, there's an defense, but there isn't necessarily this guy's going to win, this guy's going to lose. If the guy that's attacking has a better opening, he can change and attack in a different way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
He has a prescribed attack he's going to initiate. If your defense is bad, you lose. I mean, I hate to use the word winners and losers in that situation, but you'll get hit.
Yeah.
They'll show you, look, you had an opening here, I tagged your shoulder, you still haven't hit me. I didn't get attacked. I didn't get hit. You got hit. You lost.
Yeah.
And we're wielding 3-foot razor blades, so it makes a difference.
So kata is not only solo form.
Mm-hmm.
It can be form you do with someone. It can be a drill, sort of, that starts in a specific way, but then it evolves naturally, right?
In Koru, I think we would actually switch the terms kata and drill from the way most.
There you go.
We have things that are solo that I would refer more to as drills,
Mm.
and then the two-man application.
Very interesting. Yeah, I think that's good. It opens for people to be a little more open-minded. I think there's too much assumption of what a kata means of doing a form solo, which may have a lot of value. I certainly do that too. But kata is also a system of practice with someone else.
Mm-hmm.
Very good.
Like in Aikido, it's exclusively two-man kata.
Yeah.
I mean, you see it as this nice big flowing thing, but it's a prescribed attack, a prescribed response, and then you go from there.
And then you go from there.
thing, but that's what kata is. It's not free form. Everyone kind of knows their role, so to speak.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So if we continue with the history, and you've been mentioning weapons, I'm going to then take that thread a little bit, and perhaps there are listeners who associate martial arts with empty hand systems. Well, what do you say to that? What do you think?
Again, I think it was Ian Abernathy who I first heard the term, but he broke up martial arts, and he said there's military arts, which you kind of talked about a little bit, and then there's civilian arts, which are the more self-defense oriented ones. Unarmed is almost exclusively going to be civilian. Humans are tool users. There's some biology that says this is a good weapon, but it's really not. I mean, human skulls are really hard. That's not the best way to do anything.
Yeah.
Grappling and wrestling is not the most efficient way to do something. Not if I have a rock, right? These are much more efficient ways to stop whatever the attack is, to disable the other person, whatever the goal happens to be in that situation. Humans are tool users. We're not that great biologically. So yeah, we have designed since we've been human, as far as I can tell, tools specifically designed to hurt other humans. So, that's what you should use if that's your goal. If this is a military art, that's what you should be using. When we have the civilian arts, that do have weapons, karate or Wing Chun has the butterfly swords behind you, that type of thing. I think those are either something that they would have to have on them all the time, or it's a training implement meant to emphasize specific aspects of something else. Weapons are great amplifiers. They will show you all of your flaws instantly, but they'll also show you all your good things too. So if you're doing something good, it gets better. If you're doing something worse and bad, it gets worse. So they're good for that as well. So they are very good training implements.
Yeah, so if I hear you correctly, there are arts, perhaps civilian, in which there's some weapons because they are part of the training program. But in Koryu, the weapon was fundamental to the art. Just like if we say HEMA is not doing swords because it's good for the fist, it's doing swords because you use a sword.
Right. And again, think of the modern military. How much time in boot camp do you spend learning on your rifle? How much do you spend, with trying to punch someone?
Yeah.
Does the punching someone develop certain skills that are good? Yeah, but it's not what they're going to be doing day to day.
No. Well, and in fact, I think there is, exactly. We hope it's not. And there is very little, in fact, for what I've heard from certain sources. I think people assume that in the military, they are incredible fighters, and it's minimal. It's almost just to put a checkbox, Yeah. Not only that, in law enforcement, in police, in FBI, they do very little of hand combat. It's just something that they have as a plan C, D, E.
Which again, if you have civilian martial arts, which are self-defense, and you have military martial arts, which are have their own specific goals, law enforcement is a separate goal strategy.
It's separate.
It's not either of those two.
No.
They're required to go into bad situations. Self-defense, the idea is I need to do what I need to do to get out of bad situations.
Yeah.
So, but then they also aren't allowed to have the military.
Exactly.
I don't know if I want to use that word necessarily, but they have to put hands on people, and there's levels of violence that are not acceptable as an outcome. Man, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very interesting one, because perhaps they say, well, the law has certain level of flexibility for them, but very little. What's acceptable is just a little bit more than what it would be for a normal civilian. And that's actually really hard. I've always said this, and I learned this concept from Aikido's founder. And full disclaimer, I'm not an Aikido practitioner, but this idea that to control without hurting someone is way harder than to hurt someone is just so common sense. All you need to do is train with someone and realize what I'm saying. Like if you train with someone who's someone who's resisting or not cooperating with you, and you want to establish some level of control, versus just hitting them really quickly and hurting them, is way harder to not hurt someone, way harder. It requires higher levels of mastery or practice.
It requires completely different mindset and tactics. It's beyond skill. It's not. There's this idea in the Aiki arts. I'll lump that all together. That if you just do it long enough, you'll be good enough that you won't have to hurt someone. It's like no.
It's a different thing.
Yes, it requires a completely different mindset of going in.
Yeah.
It requires a completely different skill set.
Yeah. So continuing with the history that you were saying, and the weapons are now, we've established in this choreo you're describing, their integral part, right? So we continue with that. What happens to Japan? What is the next phase in this development of the martial arts in that line that you're describing?
So ironically, the Meiji Restoration, 1860s, is when Europe really started having an influence. They were starting to do more trade. They were starting to get more ambassadors, blah, blah, blah. Japan saw the future in China. They saw how Europe was kind of carving out pieces of China and kind of claiming different pieces of it. And they're like, yeah, we're not going to allow that to happen. So their solution was to become European clone. I don't know what else you would want to say. Modernize as quickly and as rapidly as they could. And overall, they did an amazing job for that. That was kind of their overall theory. As part of that, martial arts was seen for several decades as being passé and old-fashioned and useless because people don't do that anymore. We've got guns, we've got bayonets. Why would you learn how to use a sword? That type of thing. Same argument we have today. Sports became a much more important thing. They started saying, well, if this is the way the Europeans are doing it, maybe we should try this. And, someone as revolutionary as Jigoro Kano kind of figured that out. And he says, well, we can do both. I can take the sport aspect and apply it to all the old jujitsu stuff that we still love. And it can be a Japanese sport type of thing. And that actually became a very, very successful model for him. Kendo kind of followed along in those same paths. I'm kind of fudging dates, but the overall process was kind of the same. They had been training with Shinai, with the bamboo swords that they use in Kendo. They've been doing that for since the mid 1700s, so for a lot longer than people think. But then they sportified it to kind of keep that idea alive.
Yeah.
Isn't in the same way that judo isn't battlefield techniques, Kendo is not Japanese swordsmanship. And then, it fully admits it. Like it's paragraph 1 in the Kendo handbook says, this is not Japanese swordsmanship. This is not swordsmanship, I think is the way it's referred to. And then it kind of proceeds like that for a while. And then, kind of like every generation, they want to say, well, I've done this part. Why is it like this? Looking at the history aspect, there always seems to be like a 2-generation change of everything. It's like, I don't want to do what my parents did, but I want to look back farther and see what my grandparents did, because that's the old way. That's the cool way. So there kind of was a little bit of a revival of the older Japanese martial arts. Then we get World War II happening, and that screwed up a lot of ideas of martial arts in Japan. They weren't banned the way that we think that they were. That's a misnomer. It's nobody was sure if they were banned or not. The actual proclamation said that they couldn't have their weapons, and anything displaying martialness, or somehow it was phrased. I'd have to go and look it up again. But people are like, well, does that mean we can do judo? Because that's a sport. And they're like, okay, it's a sport. Go do it. They're like, okay, well, what about Aikido? This is this nice flowing art that isn't anything to do with, hitting people. And like, yeah, okay, fine, do that. Well, the only thing that was there were 2 things that were specifically not done right after World War II: karate, which had been applied to the Japanese military, and then kendo, which they associated too much with the swords, I guess. That didn't start up until a few years after World War II. 1951, I think, is when the All Japanese Kendo Federation restarted. So, and then from then, I don't know. I've asked people. In my head, if I go to Tokyo and just kind of walk around, I'll find 6 dojos, type of thing. But that does not, from people I've talked to, that doesn't seem to be the case. It'd be like someone going into New York City and going, "Okay, I'm in America. Where are all the cowboys?"
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like, well, I mean, there's a Western bar over there, and that type of thing. It's like they know it exists, but you have to go looking for it, type of thing.
Yeah. Exactly. And so you've mentioned a few things. First of all, let's take a step back. When you mentioned Kano, Jigoro Kano, the creation of judo, what a genius. I mean,
I think he has more to do with what we consider modern martial arts, regardless of style, than maybe any other man.
any human on earth, probably.
Yeah, I mean, belts.
Belts, geese. But the genius of understanding this, the social circumstance. And at the same time, because imagine, it would have been so easy for certain systems to just die or almost die or become superficial that you can't really, this traditional thing in martial art, it was too brutal to do, therefore we don't do it, therefore we don't know it because we've never done it.
Right.
He figured out a way to take those skills, and thanks to that, judo just keeps improving in the sense that the moment you're testing yourself, even though he has to establish rules, and one could argue that's not the same as the preservation of jiu-jitsu. I understand, but he understood something's got to give. And given that social condition, might as well preserve something and make a system out of it that could continue testing itself and improve. And I think that's genius. He was a genius.
Well, there's 2 aspects we can talk about with that one too. In general, most of us are doing anachronistic arts.
Yeah.
These are things that have nothing to do with what our lives look like.
Wait a minute. When you go to buy milk, you don't get 20 zombies and 70 ninjas.
Okay, so I think that's why people love zombie movies. Yeah, I do too. It takes all of our modern skills, all the stuff that, you can fill out that TPS report and be the most badass accountant in the world, and completely washes it all away and removes it down to the most basic survival levels that we all wish we had. But none of us have.
None of us have, yeah.
I mean, I shouldn't say none, but it's, generally speaking, if there was, the asteroid bombed us back into the Stone Age, 99% of humanity would be screwed.
Yeah.
Just because we don't have those skills anymore. And I think there's a wanting to go back and do that, to be this anachronistic skills that say, if it happened, I'd at least be somewhat prepared, And I think that's some of our, there's a Luddite draw to martial arts in that it doesn't use technology. There's no app that can make you swing a sword better.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's cool because it's so ingrained to who we are and in developing ourselves. So then if we ask a challenging question, perhaps the way you describe Koryu, am I pronouncing it Koryu?
Yeah, it's okay. So in Japanese, it's Koryu, but Ryu is one syllable.
Koru.
Yeah, it's Ryu.
Koryu.
Yeah, something like that. I'm not Japanese, but I at least know how it's supposed to sound.
Yeah. Could I then just say, in reality, based on how you described that, one can't actually practice it because that environment is gone, at least for us who are not non-military. In other words, to really practice Koryu, we have kind of redefined what it means, right?
Well, if you remember, I said way at the beginning that we're a neo-Koryu.
Yeah, there we go.
Particular. Some of the schools have, as part of their dogma, I guess for lack of a better term, part of their dogma of their school, they have to keep everything 100% the same. Some schools are allowed to adapt. If you're really a principle-based martial art, what you have in your hand doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you have something in your hand. The movement is going to be the same. The principles will be the same. Meaning, the way I draw a sword and the way I draw a pistol are almost identical. Mm-hmm. It's the same movements.
Mm-hmm.
So you can, you can train for one thing and have that apply in multiple ways, as long as you know what the applications are. If you make it about that one technique, look how quick I can draw a sword, haha. Well, then you're good at drawing a sword, and that doesn't help you in any way situation. You know, unfortunately, we don't have swords everywhere anymore.
Yeah. But we have taken an art, again, you said anachronistic, right? Which is clearly what's happening to most of us with, you know, the martial arts from the East. And when they were Koryu, and they were so ingrained to what was going on in society with the warring of the various clans, the fact that we do them now as Koryus, and we call it Neo-Koryu, but in reality, we do them because they make us happy. We don't, like most of us, it's not like say, hey, you know, I'm training this jiu-jitsu, whatever it is, because tomorrow I'm going to be in the military, it's going to help me. Most times that's not the rationale, right? Even though there may be cases, certainly I don't have that experience.
There's only two reasons to join a martial art. Self-defense and fitness. Those are the only two things. Ask anybody. That's the first two things they'll tell you.
A lot of people say self-defense, but when you look at their lives, they also don't live in a particularly danger. I think it's the reason you need to give to yourself too. But in reality, it's just something that connects us with something past or human and makes us very happy. Now, there may be cases. I understand there are people who their neighborhoods were more, and it may be unfair to say that self-defense is not.
Let me clarify and say there's only two reasons people say they do martial arts.
Very good.
You know, when they say self-defense, what they really mean, maybe even not admitting to themselves, is they want physical confidence. You know, it could be that they want to be confident going into someplace. It could be that they literally just want to be able to control their body better, which again, the reason you join a martial art and the reason you stay in a martial art are usually completely different things.
Exactly.
In a year, 2 years, you should know enough to be able to be fit or to be self-defense, right?
Yeah.
If that's the goal of your martial art. So staying beyond that means, well, it's something besides one of those two things.
Yeah. If you tell me you've been doing the art 30 years, you're getting clearly something out of that that's way beyond the useful reasons you had at the beginning, clearly.
And to be honest, skill acquisition is 100% a legitimate reason to be in a martial art. It's, I want to get better at something.
Yeah.
It could be for, you know, internal reasons, or it could be for external reasons. I want to get better at something so that I can move up the hierarchy and be in charge of something in my life.
Yeah.
That's a completely, it is a legitimate reason, even though nobody would ever say that out loud.
Yeah, but it is. And as you mature in the journey, you realize maybe that's it. That's what it is for you. And you challenge yourself and you give yourself a series of some sort of testing so that you know when you are actually improving, and then you improve. It's like when someone says, I'm getting better at painting, and it doesn't save your life, and you have your own way to determine how is it getting better. And that challenge, that allows, because if there's no right or wrong, how could you challenge yourself?
You know, you made me, triggered a memory there. You know, when people say, why do you use swords? You know, nobody had swords anymore. I asked them, I said, well, why do we still have painters? Yep. Photography is more accurate. Exactly.
It's exactly the same. And I believe as we may not see this, but as society improves and less conflict and hunger and all of that, as we overcome our social issues, people will have more time for art. Because I believe what makes us happy is not to do things that are useful for life, is the expression of ourselves. Let's go back to history. You mentioned right there really quickly Aikido, but we haven't really delved into what were the historical situations and individuals that gave rise to Aikido, and what is Aikido?
Okay, that's an interesting question. And it will 100% depend on who you ask. If you ask some people, Aikido is, this philosophical pursuit that's expressed physically. If you ask some people, it is the most badass martial art in the world and can kill all the ninjas that you could ever encounter, type of thing. Because, ninjas, that's what we all train for.
Yes.
That's the third reason, physical fitness, self-defense, ninjas.
Ninjas that can, shoot a poison dart in the night, and you have to be awake enough to.
Right.
Exactly.
Aikido is an art that was developed by Morihei Ueshiba, who, although he studied lots of different martial arts, it's mainly taken from Daito-ryu Aikijutsu, which again was probably a neo-koryu. It was, as far as anybody can tell, it was Takeda was the person that O-sensei studied from. O-sensei is Ueshiba. As far as anyone can historically tell, that's the first time anyone used the term Daito-ryu Aikijutsu, Daito-ryu Aikijujutsu, depending on what his particular day.
Right.
Taking anything away from the guy, the stories about him are badass, and he was a scary martial artist guy. O-sensei took a lot of the stuff from him, a lot of the controlling techniques that had in his martial art, and applied a religious filter. O-sensei was kind of a religious fanatic nut, to the point where he and his religion went and invaded Manchuria one day to establish utopia. It didn't go so well for him.
Didn't go well.
No, they were all captured by the Chinese government and about to be executed when Japan said, "No, those are our people. Give them back."
Give them back. Come on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, it wasn't officially called Aikido until I think it was 1942. I think in 1920s it was starting to be called Aikibudo. 1940s it was called Aikibudo, because Takeda Sensei came down to Tokyo and Ueshiba was going, "Look at this, see, we got all these students, we're doing awesome." He's like, "That's great. That's not Daito-ryu. You can't call it that anymore." So he's like, "Okay, we'll call it something else." So they came up with the term Aikibudo, which again eventually developed into Aikido. We were talking earlier about the lack of systemization.
Yeah.
Sensei had no system. He just taught random stuff and called it all Aikido. It was actually his son and I can't remember which one of his students that kind of took everything that he was teaching and kind of systematized it and made a curriculum out of it and said, "Okay, if you want to get better at this, here's the steps to get better at this."
Yeah.
O-sensei was a crazy old man. No disrespect intended. But he was a crazy old man.
Yeah. I mean, like many geniuses, they don't make a system, they express themselves. They have tremendous genius, but then once they're gone, it's up to us to pick up the pieces, and the various successors will do it in different ways. That has happened many times.
And I think he was answering questions above what the people were asking the questions were expecting. They'd ask, say, "Sensei, how do I do this?" They wouldn't ask him because you would never do that. But, the idea is, "Sensei, how do you do this technique?" He goes, "Well, you have to let the light flow from your hands."
Mm-hmm.
It's like, do I move my hand up or down? That level of thing. He was talking at such a higher level than what they were needing.
Yeah.
He just says, "Well, just go do it. When you do it, it's Aikido."
Yeah.
That doesn't help me. Which step, should I put my right foot forward or, should I step backwards? Oh, no, just do Aikido.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's easy to judge that, but I actually have tremendous respect. Look, for any endeavor in life, for physics, if someone is too high in their level of experience and understanding, it appears that we can't, we either find it too difficult, that person can't really teach the average, and we may also appear to us that they don't know that much because they're speaking at a level. And I've always thought that it's very hard. How a lot of people get into the martial arts and immediately in this current time, because we're so taught to be entitled because of Facebook and being able to like or not like something, we say, "Oh no, this is not going to work." I say, "Man, you have 5 minutes of experience and you can just already judge if something's going to work or not. And it may take a lifetime of work." So, I mean, some people are just maybe too good to teach.
Yeah.
To be honest, there are very few people who can pick it up.
So speaking of teaching, like I said, that's kind of one of my other things I look about is how to teach martial arts. There's a psychological phenomenon that's called the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Mm.
There's two sides to it. The one that most people use, or the most people that know about, is, and it's just what you were talking about. Analysis of a skill requires metacognition of the skill. So this is the way they did this study. It says the people with the lowest amount of a skill in something continuously have no ability to judge whether they're good at it or not.
Mm-hmm.
You tend to overjudge their ability at something. The more skill someone has in something, the more accurate their judgment of their skill level is. Okay, so it's usually referred to as, the people with the least amount of skill don't know enough to know they don't know enough.
Exactly.
That type of thing. But then there's a point where, your knowledge and your what you think you know kind of cross. And at that point, you get the other side of the Dunning-Kruger effect, which a lot of people don't talk about. And it's when you have more skill than you, more skill, you have a high amount of skill. I'll put it that way. You underestimate the difficulty of the beginning stuff. Because it's easy for you and you can do it, it must be easy for everyone else too.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's the part that nobody really thinks about. But from the teaching perspective, that's the one most teachers have to be aware of. Not necessarily, I mean, I guess they have to be aware of the other one from the student's perspective, but from the teacher's perspective, it's, I can't assume everybody can punch because, look, just go like this, it's easy.
Yeah.
So, there's a lot of small mechanics that need to be in there in a punch.
Yeah.
I mean, how to step across most martial arts, not all, but most of them spend, at least the better part of the first year of learning is how to walk for that martial art, how to step, how to move.
Yes.
And, once you do it well enough, you're like, oh, well, it's easy. Everyone should be able to do this.
Yeah.
That's why I pet peeve of martial arts. They say, in the advertisement, we teach natural movements. It's like, no, you don't. Because if you're natural, that's what you would be doing automatically.
No way. Exactly. It's exactly what we don't do, because exactly otherwise we would do it.
So yeah, that's the other part of the Dunning-Kruger from the teacher's perspective is you assume everything is easy because you can do it.
Yeah, it's funny because in the martial arts, there is this thing like a young kid looking for their kung fu teacher or karate teacher, and they're looking for someone invincible who's superhuman, and say, look, can you imagine when Cus D'Amato was training Mike Tyson? Can you imagine Tyson saying, let me punch you, see if you, but that guy knew how to make him better. That's what we're looking for, someone that knows how to make you better. And if someone is so untouchable and so invisible, they're probably not wasting time teaching anyone, man. What we're looking is someone that can make you better.
Well, that's also the difference between a coach. A coach is someone who doesn't necessarily know how to do it as well, but they can make you better at it. Rather than it's someone who's a good martial artist. I'll take, if it's like, most of the best martial artists are usually the guys that were the little skinny kid growing up, is because they had to make their techniques work. The gifted athlete who's playing in the NFL is probably not going to be the best person in martial arts, one, because they don't need to be, and two, because they have gifted athletics. They can't tell you how they're doing it.
Exactly.
Whereas the little skinny kid who needs his technique to be perfect has had to analyze every single little thing that he's done to make it awesome.
Yeah. And for me to learn, I have to have someone that is relatable to me. And that doesn't mean an invincible master of the Wu-Tang Mountain. It means someone that has had enough of a journey to relate to the challenges that I have, which are exactly what you said. I used to have a teacher who was very, very strong. And, maybe this is unfair, because people can be strong and good at an art that doesn't emphasize strength. But to me, I'm talking about many years ago, right? Mm-hmm. I am naturally critical of that. Like, if you are preaching that you're doing this not by muscle, but by body mechanics, and you are freaking full of muscle, it's way harder. I'm not saying it's impossible, But I'm just saying it's very difficult, because how would you even, if you can push me around by the power of your muscles, where is the discipline? How are you challenged to know that you're doing it by mathematics mechanics? For me, one of the things about Yip Man was how skinny he was and how little he was. But when you were telling the story of O Sensei, it reminded me so much, because Yip Man had zero system, and it fell on his students who were so different, personalities, social circumstances, interest, commercial acumen or business acumen, so different. That's why we have this crazy infighting in Wing Chun, because he didn't leave anything writing. He just taught like a madman. And he wasn't like O Sensei in the sense of spiritual religious, but he was in the martial arts very much as himself.
Yeah, Ip Man's a weird one. I tried to do I think I did one episode on it.
Yes, you did.
And
I devoured it.
there just isn't much written
There
on
isn't much.
Very little actual history of the man.
Yeah.
So that's in a lot of ways, that's a bad thing, because it lets you put whatever you want on him.
Yeah.
He becomes just kind of an outline of a figure, and you fill in what you want him to be.
Yeah.
If you want him to be an invincible fighter, there's nothing that says he wasn't.
Yeah.
Want him to be a frail old man who could barely teach, well, then there's nothing that says he wasn't, know?
Yeah, exactly. I just hope people don't think when we say Yip Man, we mean Donnie Yen. As long as we accomplish that, we're successful. You're making
maybe that's Aikido's problem. We haven't had an O Sensei movie yet.
There you go. Yeah. I need to bring you back to talk about Musashi Miyamoto, because I think there's also so much around it. And clearly, so many people inspired by the book, some of his books and writings. So I see maybe this, since we're coming up to more than an hour, maybe we'll make it a series, and every now and then come and discuss a different section of the history of the arts, because I am fascinated by it and learning so much from you.
Okay. Yeah, I'd love to talk to you anytime you want to, man.
Very good. Well, Mr. Wilson, I think we'll call it a day. And I have a lot of questions I haven't asked you, and I think it's good to leave the audience wanting more. And
so next time, Musashi.
Yes, next time, Musashi. Exactly. Well, thank you very much. And thanks to the listeners.
Oh, thank you.